And thanks. And yeah, so as somebody that grew up, well, I grew up with a stovepipe in my house, not exactly the brick chimney that most people imagine. But we had to clean it every year, and we actually do it ourselves. I still do it. I still run up to the old home in Montana to sweep out the chimney. But if you're looking for a chimney sweep, or you're looking for more information about how to, determine if there's the proper chimney sweep for your chimney, then you can look at the CSIA website. There's a FAQ that I just put in the chat. And yeah, but with the holidays coming around, we should all be thinking about the sweeping out the chimney, because it is getting cold. Okay, so we'll go through a few of our typical intros. This meeting is going to be recorded, and then one or more decision makers may be present during the meeting, but no decisions will be taken. Let's do a quick roll call one more time, just to see if all of our parties are here. Is Southern California Edison here today?
Good morning. This is Chris Vias with Southern California Edison, and we have others on the line also from Edison.
Thanks, Chris. And anyone from Turn, from the Utility Reform Network?
Good morning, Eddie. This is Tom Long from Turn, and I'm joined by our consultant, Chuck Feinstein.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Mussy Grade Road Alliance?
Joseph Mitchell from Mussy Grade Road Alliance.
Dr. Mitchell. Semper Companies?
Good morning, Eddie. We're on the call. Thank you.
And Pacific Gas and Electric?
Yes, we are present. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. And Energy Producers and Users Coalition Indicated Shippers?
Yes, Eddie, this is Jim Mosier, and Colin Fitzhenry from Brubaker Associates will be joining.
Okay, great. Thank you, sir. Public Advocate's Office? Anyone
Hey, Eddie,
we're
here.
Okay, thank you, Miles. And then Protect Our Communities Foundation today, or the Utility Consumers Action Network. And if there are any others, actually, is Matthew Raffleson from Level 4 joining us?
Matthew is here.
Thank you, sir. Okay, great. If there's anyone else that would like to be recognized, please put your note in the chat, and you will be recognized through the chat. Let's see. We're going to, again, kind of stick fairly strictly to our agenda for today. I just wanted to mention that this morning, I'm going to run through about 5 slides to talk specifically about risk tolerance and exceedance curves. And I don't envision that it's going to take 25 minutes, but I would appreciate if we could just kind of hold discussion until after that's done, just so that we're all kind of on the same page with where the staff proposal is coming from. And then I'm sure we'll have a very robust discussion about that. And I've left a lot of time all the way until 11:15 for us to have a discussion on that particular topic. And then we'll come back after the break, have a brief intro into the simple optimization portfolio approach. That should actually be pretty quick, and I think that we can continue to have a Q&A on that topic. But remember that we're going to continue to have a discussion about optimization tomorrow. We will have about a half hour or more of general discussion today. If there's not a whole lot of questions about portfolios, we can kind of shift back to the exceedance curve conversation. And then we will continue the discussion tomorrow. Let's see, I just want to go over some attendee participation. If you have any IT related questions, you can direct those to George. And George, could you throw your email in the chat just in case? Attendees all have the ability to mute and unmute themselves. And you can also, we would ask that you stay muted except during the Q&A period, as I just mentioned. And during the presentation portion of each session, attendees can enter questions in the chat box. And please remember to address the questions to everyone so that we all get a chance to see them. And then we'll do our best to, occasionally, interrupt if there's a clarifying question, although again, I would hope that we could save that until the end. And then we'll, of course, go through some non-clarifying questions in the discussion period. But if there's not enough time today to respond to all the chat box questions, we'll collect those. We'll collect answers to those questions and circulate them to the service list after the workshop. And then during the discussion, please use the hand raise function as much as possible. And, I'll do my best to call folks in the order that pops up in WebEx. But also, please remember to lower your hand after you're done speaking. I don't think it does it automatically. So, right. So let's go ahead and jump into this next topic on risk tolerance. Now that we've discussed, tail risk and probability distributions yesterday, I think we can talk about risk tolerance, and it's best understood through visualizations. Ultimately, we want to conceptualize maximum value of risk that is acceptable for Californians, and that should be constant depending on the likelihood and consequence of a risk event. So we would call this line the constant risk exceedance curve, because in this hypothetical example that we have here, each point on the line represents just 1 penny of risk or 1 cent. So if the likelihood of risk event occurring in a given year is 10%, or 1 in 10, once every 10 years event, then we would be willing to accept an outcome worth 10 cents of damage. Now, if the likelihood is 0.01%, or a 1 in 10,000 year event, then we would accept an outcome worth $100 of damage. And any risk event that exhibits levels above the constant risk exceedance curve is unacceptable and requires mitigation until that risk is brought down within the tolerable risk zone. That's the basic function of how we're looking at this risk tolerance exceedance curve. And with regard to risk scaling in the staff proposal, and Mark, is it all right if I get back to you at the end here?
Yeah, of course. Yep, during the Q&A.
Thank you. So with regard to risk scaling in the staff proposal, we argued that risk tolerance and exceedance curves are the proper place to integrate the risk scaling function. And we want to review just for a moment what a risk scaling function currently does in the RDF. At present, the utilities multiply a risk-averse scaling function against risk-neutral values. And as we saw yesterday, that has the effect of shifting the whole curve to the right, which is why the risk-averse scaling curve is convex. However, since SPD is recommending that the utility present tail average risk as a second number in its risk assessment in addition to average risk, it would really not be appropriate to simultaneously scale the entire risk curve. Instead, the proper presentation of Californians' risk-averse attitude would be to modify risk tolerance. And to do this, the utility would divide the constant risk exceedance curve by the risk-averse scaling function. And that's what's depicted in this figure. This application of the risk-averse scaling function would bend the exceedance curve into a concave shape, as you can see in the figure. And in this example, the risk-averse exceedance curve that's green here is rightfully seen to be below the constant risk exceedance curve that's blue. And this green line signifies that Californians have a lower acceptable level of overall residual risk for tail risks. And then that red line is a hypothetical result of overall residual risk after taking into consideration a portfolio of mitigations. And in this case, the mitigations would address the constant risk exceedance curve, so it would be below that. But because Californians are averse to tail risk events, that means that there is still more mitigation work to do. And the staff proposal asks a really important question here. If there were no risk tolerance curves, how would anyone accept that level of risk reduction represented by the red line was or was not sufficient? Staff completely recognize that different stakeholders will hold different degrees of aversion and neutrality towards risk, and creating these risk tolerance thresholds is essential for making those deliberations public and transparent. And once a standard, or once a risk tolerance threshold is agreed upon, we can redouble our efforts towards determining the best way to optimize a portfolio of mitigations within certain constraints, most notably budget constraints, so we can start properly addressing affordability. So Before we get into the optimization discussion later on, there's a few more issues that we need to address in the context of risk tolerance. So while the staff proposal is recommending tail average risk to be an integral part of establishing a risk tolerance threshold, it should not be used to evaluate a benefit cost ratio. Obviously, an ideal benefit cost ratio is 1 or above, where the benefits are greater than the costs. Of course, in some cases, there may be operational constraints, or maybe there's state or federal legislation that requires mitigations to be implemented despite having a low BCR. But in this example here, we can see that if the scaled average or tail average is considered for estimating the BCR of a portfolio of mitigations, then it will always create the illusion of high cost efficiency. So going forward, staff recommend that BCRs only be based on unscaled average risk, on the unscaled average risk reduction. And establishing risk tolerance curves is a significant task that should not be left up to utilities alone. Ultimately, staff argue that a risk tolerance threshold must be set for Californians as a whole. And that's why we feel it's necessary for the Commission to authorize a working group that we are calling the California Utility Risk Tolerance Stakeholder Working Group, which is a mouthful, so I'm going to call it the CURTS Working Group. And the CURTS Working Group should include parties to the RDF proceeding, as well as the parties to the utility's most recent GRC and RAMP proceedings. And finally, due to the importance of the wildfire risk in RAMP and GRC applications, SPD has also recommended that representatives from the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety also join the CURTS Working Group. And SPD recommends that utilities should present their approach to risk tolerance to the CURTS Working Group and integrate any feedback that they receive before filing a RAMP application to the Commission. Specifically, the CURTS Working Group should come to a consensus on which tolerances are needed, which we're going to discuss that in the next slide. And then also we need to, the CURTS Working Group would also determine what the average risk and tail average value should be for each of those tolerance thresholds, if tail average values would be necessary. As we stated earlier, staff envisioned that once the important discussions of risk tolerance thresholds are addressed before the RAMP is submitted, it should allow for the RAMP evaluation to focus upon the accuracy and transparency of the risk modeling rather than on individual mitigation programs or even the details of the RRUs. So finally, staff argue that when risk tolerances are established, it should be presented as aggregated dollars of overall residual risk, and also at the monetized attribute level for each of the 3 consequences, including safety, reliability, and financial. So an important decision the Commission can start to make in phase 4, at least our recommendation, is how quickly should we start rolling out risk tolerance thresholds. Risk tolerance can be established for each risk individually, or it can even be set at the enterprise level. And the latter approach, though, would require the utility to determine how much of the total enterprise risk is apportioned off to each risk event. So given that wildfire is so central to risk assessments and RAMP applications in California, SPD has recommended that the utility be required to immediately define risk tolerance thresholds for the wildfire risk event. That does then leave the utility with a bucket, so to speak, of other risks, and a distinct risk tolerance threshold could be established to cover the rest of the non-wildfire risks. How that catch-all bucket of risk tolerance is apportioned off to the other risks should then be explained clearly by the utility in collaboration with the CURTS Working Group. Ultimately, staff feel that asking the utility and CURTS to establish a tolerance threshold for overall residual risk and the 3 attributes for every risk within a RAMP application could be a very large task initially. And staff encouraged the CURTS Working Group and the Commission to evaluate how much deliberation is necessary to establish the recommended 6 thresholds before jumping into approximately 30 or more thresholds. And I'm going to stop there, at least with the slides. And we do have some additional language changes that we're recommending related to this particular topic, adding a couple of definitions. And then we have, of course, some additional requirements for the RDF rows. And we can go through that language as well if there's anything that needs to be cleared up. We're happy to also take questions about anything that's been presented here. And I know that, Mark, you've had your hand up for the entire presentation, so I'll let you go ahead and ask your question first, and I'm assuming you wanted to go back to that first slide. Is that right, Mark?
Perfect. Thank you, Eddie. That was really helpful. Yeah, and I wanted to pause on this slide because I think it's, one of the central concepts here, and I want to make sure we have a crystallized technical understanding of what this means. So I have a couple of related questions. My first one is, on this diagram, is this effectively, in technical parlance, meant to be a bound on the cumulative distribution function of a risk? And I say that in the sense of, if you just take, 1 minus the cumulative distribution function of a risk, let's be a little bit ambiguous about at what granularity, but, ultimately, right? Oh, and I'm sorry. This is Mark Lee from PG&E. Thank you, Tom. And ultimately, you can plot that, right? And what you're going to have is, for each level of consequence, what that curve is going to tell you is, what is the probability, according to my distribution, right, that I fall above that consequence. And so long as that curve is below this, this blue line, this hyperbola, then we're in the tolerable risk zone. If any part of that 1 minus CDF curve falls into the red zone, that's not allowable. Is that an accurate understanding, or did we mean something else?
So I think I'll also reach out to Matthew just to make sure that I understand why you're specifically describing this in terms of the CDF curve, and why you would think of it as 1 minus the CDF. If you could maybe just.
So Eddie, let me jump in here.
Sure.
Because I'd like to say, Mark, what you're saying is correct. And the 1 minus CDF curve is basically that likelihood, that starts at 100% on the y-axis and goes down to 0. So your interpretation, I think, is correct.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. That's really helpful. And then on a couple of related notes. So one, it's also correct based on, I think, a couple of slides that you presented later, Eddie, that, the level of granularity that this curve exhibits is still kind of up for discussion, right? So this could be for the enterprise level, this could be for a tranche level, and that would necessitate, if we were doing at the enterprise level, going back to the dam failure example from yesterday, it would kind of necessitate an understanding of the joint modeling of all risks comprised with it, that aggregate up to the enterprise level. Is that fair to say as well?
So the enterprise level would be at the entire level of PG&E. It would not be at an individual risk event. I just want to make sure that you're clear about that. That's what that's referring to.
Perfect. Yes, exactly. And so I guess my point is, if we were to establish that risk tolerance curve for that enterprise level, then it would be the case that, because then you need to think about the dependent structure of all your all the constituents of your enterprise risk, right? So if, dam failures in one region are related to dam failures in another region, are related to climate, are related to, distribution overhead incidents, these all need to be jointly modeled if we were to do it at the enterprise level.
And so the recommendation that we're making right now, though, is that, wildfire risk event would be, a risk tolerance would be established for that separately. And then, yes, the risk of your enterprise risk would be, have a tolerance level that you would then need to work with the Kurtz working group to determine how it should be apportioned off to the rest of your risks.
Okay, perfect. And okay, one last question. Sorry, I'm done after this, I promise. If we go back to slide 36, just another technical question. So now with the
37?
Yeah. 37. Yep, perfect. With the understanding that this blue line does represent a bound effectively on the cumulative distribution function, or the flip of that, right? I can think of an example, for instance, where what's allowable under this curve? Well, it's allowable to have 100% chance of 1 cent loss, right? That's the first point on this curve. It's not allowable to have 100% chance of 1 cent plus 0.00001, right? So you can't deviate even slightly above 1 cent. But then it is still allowable to have a 50-50 mix between 1 cent and 2 cents, because that's a CDF that would fall under this blue line. And so, I'm trying to interpret this curve as representative of a risk neutral preference. But along those lines, right now, what you're saying is I'm okay with losing 1 cent for sure. I'm definitely not okay with losing just a tiny fraction more than 1 cent for sure. But I'm okay with losing, right? I'm okay with a 50-50 gamble between losing 1 cent and losing 2 cents. So that would speak to, risk loving behavior, right?
Mark, this is Matthew. No, your example, would still be on this curve. A 50 of 2 and a 0 of 1 is just not shown here. It'd be in between. You mentioned risk neutrality, and this is a pretty close cousin to risk neutral curve. But conceptually, I mean, it's basically saying that, pretty much any combination of probabilities that adds up to 0.01 or less would be to either on or to the or below the curve.
Yeah, I think I agree with you actually, Matt. So I guess the point is it's okay for me to lose 1 cent for sure. It's okay for me to take a 50-50 gamble between losing 1 cent and losing 2 cents because that's still below the curve.
Or lose
But it's
2
not
cents,
okay for me
2
to
cents and 0 cents. 50-50.
No, even if I lose, if I do, okay. Well, I don't want to get into the. Yeah, you need to look at the equations, but I think even if you lose 50-50 between 2 cents and 1 cent, that's a cumulative distribution function that still falls below this curve. So, I mean, I guess my point is, it makes sense that the blue line is representative of risk neutral in the sense that if you multiply the x-axis and by the y-axis, you get the same number no matter where you are on the blue line. But I'm saying that under, this idea that what's allowable is a cumulative distribution function that falls below this curve, we can get some, pretty surprising behaviors.
So I'm going to open it up for maybe Dr. Mitchell to also contribute, unless Matthew, you had something specific that you wanted to reply there.
No, without seeing an example of what Mark's talking about, I can't really respond. But I'm certainly open if you have some, if you can come up with some theoretical risk curve that you're concerned about to discuss it with you.
Yeah, Dr. Mitchell, how about and everyone, if you could please remember to not just state your name, but also your affiliation as well. I really appreciate that. Thanks.
Joseph Mitchell, Mussey Grade Road Alliance. I think this is a good framework to start with, but I think there are a few conceptual problems with it that need to be addressed. Number one, regarding the role of the Kurtz group, which I agree that's a great thing to do, I don't think consensus is going to be possible or a goal. Having gone through multiple ramps and GRCs, the current utility consensus on risk tolerance is 0 risk tolerance. And that's natural. If you look at it from the utility standpoint, 0 risk tolerance checks all boxes. It takes care of everything. There is no reason for a utility to push for anything other than 0 tolerance. So I think asking the utility, well, what's your tolerance? I think we can answer that question right now. Anybody can disagree with me, but I think the utilities generally prefer the 0 risk tolerance because it covers liability, it covers reputation, it covers everything. Plus, capital investments means it's also profitable. So it's a great solution for utilities, but not necessarily for all of the public. So I think with the Kurtz, yes, we need to have the discussion to maybe come up with recommendations, but I don't think, I think making sure that there's a good record of what all stakeholder positions are is an appropriate goal for that group. If consensus can be reached, that's great, but I think more it's just fleshing out all of the arguments and making sure everything is carefully considered. And then I don't think it's a Kurtz group output. That has to be a commission output. So the Kurtz group input would go into the commission would issue a decision. Decision would then set the risk tolerance levels. That would go into the ramp, and then I think we're all happy. Now, another thing is that I think as far as how this gets attached to commission proceedings, as an intervener, I think if it's attached to the ramp, it creates kind of a problem for interveners in the sense that the intervener compensation gets attached to the GRC. So this Kurtz group would be meeting, maybe a year before the ramp, and then the ramp takes a year, and then the GRC takes over a year, and then the intervener comp program takes 1 to 2 years. And so, we end up with like a 5-year time frame between the work that's being done and interveners having a possibility of compensation. So having it attached to a proceeding such as the current proceeding or some follow-on proceeding, which would be, cover that would allow much more rapid feedback and allow interveners to get compensated for participating. Otherwise, you risk interveners being reticent about participating, and then you don't have a full representation of stakeholders at the meeting. So I think those are my concerns, and I think they're fairly easy to address. It doesn't change the overall approach, but it just changes the details of implementation. Thanks.
One thing that I just wanted to ask very quickly, Dr. Mitchell, is just that, with the Kurtz working group, I at least my vision and understanding of the purpose of that is not something that would be like a one-off opportunity to discuss risk tolerance. It's something that would, basically need to happen before every ramp. And so I thought that I think in our understanding, the natural connection for the Kurtz working group would be within a ramp proceeding. But if I hear you correctly, it sounds like that may not, from an intervener compensation perspective, that may not make the most sense just because of the time lag for compensation. I think it's probably very important that we think a little bit about what would be the proper vehicle. The RDF proceeding, I'll have to think about that a little bit. And I think it would be helpful for us to definitely discuss this through the comment period, and trying to provide some of those recommendations and comments, I think would be very helpful. So
sure.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, so I think regarding the, attaching it to the ramp, yeah, that is because it is kind of utility specific, and it will be happening we hope on a repeated basis, and hopefully there will be stakeholders involved. Interveners have kind of, lobbied for and complained about how ramp is currently handled, in the sense that ramp is not a binding proceeding. It does not make actionable decisions that can be attached to intervener compensation. It's only after everything gets rolled into the GRC and evaluated that you have an actionable decision by the commission that interveners can attach their contributions to and thereby get compensated for it. So if the ramp were somehow to be altered so that its decision would be accepted as, contributions, and in fact, if that was nothing more than making sure that the inputs, well, actually, no, because the ramp decision would have, no, actually, you need to have this before. You can't attach it to the ramp, because if you want to have the inputs be available to the utilities for use in the ramp, the decision by the commission needs to be made beforehand. So this needs to be worked out before the utilities go through all the work of putting together the ramp. Otherwise, if it's not finalized, they'd go do all that work and then it's not valid in some way because they're not using the correct risk tolerance, or the one, not correct, but the one that's agreed as the most appropriate for representing all stakeholder interests. So yeah, I think it's got to be a pre-ramp proceeding of some type with a resolution or decision coming out of it, both for the intervener compensation stake, but for the utilities so that they have something solid to hang their hat on when they start their ramps.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. I'm definitely going to take that back and try to think a little bit more about what the proper vehicle is. As you know, opening up proceedings can be, a complex venture, and so opening up a proceeding that's specific to a single utility's risk tolerance discussion also has certain drawbacks in terms of timing that we may also need to consider. So,
well, it could be a follow-on. It could be say handled because it could be either the current proceeding, and it doesn't. You could have it would actually save a lot of time and effort if we could all talk about this in the same room and have sort of general guidelines on risk tolerance, so that it's a centralized decision that's done once that can be consumed by all the utilities. Save everybody a lot of effort if it was that way. And then maybe during the ramp or GRC, if utilities want to make some sort of modification to that, then they could, make that, or we can have, for instance, a continuation of the proceeding that makes that decision if you need to make it specific tweaks for a certain utility prior to its ramp going forward. So, okay, thanks.
Thank you. Let's see, Miles, did you want to, I saw that there was a note in the chat, but Colin, I think maybe we'll come back to that. And Miles, did you want to go ahead and make your comment first?
Hi, yeah, Miles from Cal Advocates. I wanted to ask another question about Kurt's. So I heard it mentioned that the discussion around risk tolerance thresholds would potentially be utility specific, and I wanted to toss something into that discussion. I was reading yesterday where the Department of Insurance had instituted new rules allowing insurers to use forward-looking climate models. But as a result of that, they're also building a sort of public wildfire catastrophe model that could be benchmarked against insurer risk models. And I was just wondering if that was something that the commission had considered or would potentially look into for our purposes here.
So essentially benchmarking a publicly developed risk tolerance threshold that could be benchmarked against whatever the utility thresholds are for various risks,
or even benchmarking utility wildfire models.
So thanks for that suggestion. I'm definitely gonna take it into mind and think about how we might be able to integrate something like that. Yeah, that's. I actually didn't realize that I was tracking on the changes that were happening through California Department of Insurance with regard to the catastrophe models. I did not realize that they were now considering allowing the public benchmarking approach. That's a very recent change, I believe. So I will definitely look into that. But thanks for that, Miles. I appreciate that. And let's see, Brian, did you want to address any questions to us?
Hey, Eddie, thanks. Can you guys hear me? Just doing a sound check. Okay, Great, guys. So let me just get this straight operationally, because Edison is first up on deck, right? So this is Brian Landry from Edison, just for everyone's knowledge. So if I'm understanding the staff's proposal, we start with developing a risk tolerance curve, an exceedance curve. Is that right? So that'd be like step one for every risk.
In
Step
collaboration
two-
with the Kurtz working group, yes.
Right. So step two would then be presenting it to Kurtz. Kurtz would tell us, hey, we like this, we don't like this. And I know I'm simplifying it for the sake of the workshop. We would then start plotting each one of our assets or each one of our risk units, I'm assuming, pre-mitigated. Then we develop portfolios to understand what it would look like post-mitigated. And then it would go below that line. Is that essentially what we're talking about here?
Yeah, if it goes below that line, then you've essentially reached the acceptable level of risk for Californians. One thing, though, I just wanted to ask you a question, Brian. So do you envision that you would be able to establish a risk tolerance threshold before you understand what your current risk environment is?
It should be. So our position has been that the state, we agree with MGRA that the state and the commission is in charge of establishing this tolerance level. That's been our position since phase one.
And I think essentially what we're providing here is the process for doing that. And what we're providing is, or what we're recommending is that the working group as a whole develop the individual risk tolerances for each, well, at least for wildfire risk, and then a bucket of risks. And so what the commission is doing is providing the process for doing that.
Right, but I think the process is flipped, right? So it seems like we put something forward, Kurtz reviews and revises it. They like it, they don't like it, and then we come back. So it seems like sort of an iterative process. I agree with NGRA here.
Yeah,
that's why we're kind of confused.
Yeah, I think you could think of it as an iterative process, that there's an output that comes out from Kurtz that guides your final risk tolerance threshold.
And would you envision that this would occur within the next 12-month period where Edison has to file their ramp?
So that's the goal, I would say. But it's not for I don't think that we can make that final decision at this point in time. But that's definitely what SPD is recommending. Yes.
Okay. A couple of questions. Thanks, Eddie. A couple of questions on Kurtz. So, who would define the membership of Kurtz?
We've recommended the Kurtz membership to include the stakeholders to this proceeding, to each of the utilities, RAMP and GRC proceedings, and then, of course, the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. But there could, before the final decision for phase 4 is issued, there could be additional memberships that are added to that based off of comments and based off of the commission's interest.
Okay. Would other federal agencies like FERC be party to that?
Party to the decision of deciding who is on the working group?
Or no,
would
would they be actually a stakeholder within the Kurtz working group to make sure that for hydro asset failure, for instance, there would be no untoward risk tolerance levels decided?
We could definitely consider that as one of the people that could be added into the working group.
And then are Kurtz members compensated in any way? Going to MGRA's concern here.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the concern that MGRA was addressing, and I think at least from SPD's perspective, our assumption was that this was going to be connected to the ramp, and therefore it would allow interveners to be able to request compensation for their time.
And then I think the other thing is, would each member receive equal weight in the voting?
So that's an excellent question. I think that the way that the staff proposal has discussed this is that we feel that the Kurtz membership itself needs to come up with its own decision-making kind of, modus operandi, essentially. Mm-hmm. So that would kind of be like the first decision. And in that sense, it may be that there does need to be kind of a high level first meeting with all of the parties, including all three of the utilities, to discuss what that modus operandi is, because it should be universal. Even if we're going to have a working group that's specific to just SCE and talk about your risk tolerance thresholds, achieving that final iterative number should be the same as if it was done for PG&E or for the central companies.
Okay, thank you. I'm just one overall concern here is just the timing of all of this within the next 12 months when Edison files their ramp. And I'm sure that may be obvious to some, but it's literally 12 months before we have to present to a CURT's working group. So there's a lot of things that would have to occur to make this practical and reasonable.
Thank you for that. And please make sure to mention the FERC membership in CURTS in your comments. I think that's a valid thing that we can definitely consider.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Yep. Let's see. Is there? I think it's Ayana, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name.
Yeah, Ioana Cavada from PG&E. I had a clarifying question on slide 36 or 37.
37, maybe?
Yeah. So this represents an exceedance curve, and I believe it was mentioned that this is a risk-neutral exceedance curve. However, if you were to convert this into a non-cumulative curve, meaning an occurrence curve, this would have been a risk-neutral curve. So just the fact, so looking at x-axis 0.1, the probability of exceeding that value is 10%. The probability of experiencing more than $1, so 1 order of magnitude higher, is 1%. So this is a log-log plot. The slope is -1. So in order for this to be a risk-neutral curve, this would have been occurrence curve, not exceedance curve. If you were to convert this line into an occurrence curve, meaning the PDF instead of 1 minus the CDF, the slope would be not -1, but closer to -2, which means that there is some inherent risk aversion to high consequence events.
And then go ahead, Matthew, if you wanted to jump in there. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about why this would be an inherent, acceptance or aversion to high consequence events.
Yeah, I'm not really following with Ioana, because I mean at each point of this exceedance curve, the risk is the same. So technically, it's a called an ISO risk or constant risk curve.
I can try to clarify.
Yeah, it might be, because if it gets really technical, it might be hard to do this without looking at actual numbers and as you say, what the PDF of this would look like as opposed to the 1 minus CDF.
Yeah. So the exceedance curve has a slope of -1, meaning 1 order of magnitude difference in the x-axis is also a 1 order of magnitude difference in the y-axis.
Correct.
But this is an exceedance curve. So if you were to plot the occurrence curve, meaning each point would be representing what's the probability of seeing that outcome and not exceeding that outcome as it currently is, this occurrence curve wouldn't have a slope of -1. It would have a slope of -2, closer to -2. Meaning the probability of experiencing 0.1 would be higher than 1 order of magnitude relative to the probability of experiencing a $1 loss. So this curve is actually not a risk neutral curve, it's a risk averse curve.
I wanted to, oh, go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I'm not quite following the the slope of -2. The notion that this is it could be interpreted as a slightly risk averse curve. I do understand. If you're going to get very theoretical, there's actually no such thing as a risk neutral exceedance curve. Going back to the conversation that we had yesterday, if you're truly risk neutral, you just talk about the EV. You don't care about the points of the curve. So that's why technically we call this a constant risk curve. And because it is possible, for this to be breached, with low, high risk of high probability events, but very high, low probability events, it does give it a slight sense of risk aversion. But we're getting very technical on that point. I would have to understand, Ioana, again, seeing actual numbers and different ways of visualizing this to really understand your point. I'm sorry, I'm just not following it.
Yeah, I think it would actually be really helpful if there was like a concrete example of how you interpret that current distribution curve and its relationship to the exceedance curve, because I think there was like a conceptual jump there about saying that the slope was -2. I didn't follow what the reasoning was there. Would you be able to describe that more in your comments on the staff proposal?
Yes, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay.
That would
Thanks.
be that would be super helpful. Thank you, Ioana.
Okay, Vincent, I saw that you lowered your hand and then raised it. Did you want to jump in ahead of Dr. Feinstein? Or?
Yeah, I was just going to bring up, observation that I believe you clarified, that, there's no such thing as a risk neutral exceedance curve. There's no such thing as a risk neutral PDF. So that brings up the question, what does this represent? What does this constant risk exceedance curve? It represents some degree of risk aversion. You mentioned that. Whose risk aversion does it represent? What is this? What is the necessity? What is the importance of this construct?
Oh yeah, but I think Vincent, as SCE has just pointed out that they, there's a request that risk tolerances do be established for every risk, and that that's essentially at least SPD's recommendation is that be set from the perspective of Californians, the residents of California, and so.
But what is the purpose of this straight line then? I mean, it's not an risk tolerance but we have to compare to it. I mean, what I'm not understanding why we need.
So Vincent, I can answer that, and there's two explanations. First of all, it is feasible for let's say the Kurtz committee to come out and say, we would like risk tolerance to be the constant risk exceedance curve, which is this one. I mean, it's as good as any, and not get into well, it's very close to risk neutral, because it's not exactly the same thing as risk neutral. More important, this curve is to me the easiest way then to derive your risk averse curve from it, because you can apply a scaling function, a risk averse scaling function to this curve and get your risk averse curve for use. And that to me is the main purpose of it.
Maybe Dr. Feinstein, if you wanted to add your comments to the conversation at this point.
Yes, thank you very much. This is Chuck Feinstein. I'm consulting for Turn. My question was, where does the blue curve come from? And it was illustrated somewhat by Ioana's comments and Vincent's. Is it not the case that the blue curve comes by taking a lottery where the probability of an event is on the y-axis and the consequence of that event is on the x-axis. And then the lottery is binary. You either get that with, say, probability 1%, you get $1, or with probability 99%, you get nothing. And the expected value of that lottery is 1 cent. And so there's the constant risk with binary lotteries. Is that not what this blue curve is? And if it's not, please explain. I don't understand where the blue curve comes from.
Dr. Feinstein, that is correct. It's and that's just why it's the constant risk exceedance curve. The risk is constant at each point. The likelihood times consequence.
If I may follow up, then please, you're
Yeah.
suggesting then that there are an infinite number of risk tolerance exceedance curves for every possible value of risk, 1 cent, 2 cents, 3 cents, and so on.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Mitchell.
Okay, so yeah, I think when you're around long enough, you've seen everything before. I think the only person I see on the list who's been through this with me is Coco. I'm sure some other people, old timers at the utilities, have been through it too. But this goes back to the early post-2007 fire days. We had a couple of proceedings. One was the power shutoff proceeding for SDG&E. That went into sort of a negotiated settlement type of arrangement. And that went on for a couple of years with arbitration and, lots and lots and lots of meetings, and effectively went nowhere. We needed another rulemaking for power shutoff, and then that was created and came out with some conclusions. Something that did work, but it took a long time, was the rulemakings that came out post-2007 fires. And they were sort of designed to make sure that all issues were fully discussed. And I'd argue that that's kind of the precedent for what we're dealing with here, because if you throw something together with quickly, you've got a risk of ruin here that will not suit some stakeholders' needs very badly. You can err on either side and mess this up. And so I think it's very important that this be something beyond people put in comments, people put in reply comments, commission makes a decision. I think it needs, these things need to be fleshed out in workshops or working groups. What was done in the original rulemaking for power shutoff, not power shutoff, but wildfire regulations, was that a group report would be authored, and then that would be put out. Individual parties would put in file comments, and then the commission would finally make a decision based on those comments. And I think that ensures full addressing of all the important issues that are going to be brought up, because we're starting to discuss some of the technical issues here. I think as people dig into them, and we bring in additional stakeholders, because there's a lot of stakeholders like disability and other stakeholders that when they hear about this and the potential impacts, they're going to want to see it at the table too. And it's not going to be so much how do we do the technical part, it's how do we bend that curve to make sure that we're addressing all risks and all costs to all people in California, and how do we weight those? I mean, what Brian said about voting, not everybody has an equal vote because it depends on who shows up. But I think it's going to take some wisdom at the commission level to make actually the determination of how do you actually implement this. And because this can take it could take a while to do this properly and several iterations. You need to start bifurcating it very soon. So I look at, the 1 year time clock running on the SCE ramp, or I don't know, 18 months or whatever it is. That's not very much time. So I think sort of the first step in bifurcation would be to ask SCE, okay, what's your drop dead date when you need to have some kind of input, even if it's tentative, even if it's just rough guidelines for the ramp? And then we ask, okay, what can we get them by that time, if anything, right? Or do we just say, okay, it won't be SCE, it'll be the next one up? So I think that's bifurcating it and just assuming that this could take a while to do right, and you want to make sure it's done right, build the process for that and make sure it can spit out periodic bifurcated inputs and giving you the best knowledge at any given time so that the utilities can consume that and that the parties to the ramp and GRC proceedings can have something to work with too. Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yumi, go ahead.
Good morning. This is Yumi. I'm from PG&E. I think one comment about this. I have to go into the technical stuff because technical should be right in order for us to understand what it is presenting. The constant risk, I would understand if this graph is not exceedance curve, if it is just probability distribution, and it's not like declining, it might have different shape. But if that's the case, then yeah, I can see that the constant risk curve will be the point where the multiplication of the lower, the likelihood, and the consequence is the same. But because this is exceedance curve, exceedance probability, each point here, even though it's 10% probability there, the associated consequence is not 10 cents. It's expected value of that will be more than 10 cents. And so it's not the constant risk curve based on how you were describing, in my opinion. But setting that aside, if we research into how others are doing risk tolerance and compare with the risk tolerance, this probability or exceedance probability is unusual. Usually what we see out there is FN curve, the exceedance frequency at a certain consequence level. The FERC does that, or any other references that we looked at actually looks at the FN curve. And that also fits with our current methodology of looking at the ramp risk. It's event basis. So if I try to explain the difference, this one is looking at, okay, for ignition as an example, if we have 10 events per year, 10 ignitions per year, we will have to combine the consequence of that 10 events into the x-axis, and then it will be 100% exceeding 0. And then depending, the event becomes the year, right? There's no event in here if we were to look at the probability, because it's not going to differentiate 10 events happening per year versus 1 event happening per year for sure, right? The probability of having an event is 100%, regardless of whether it's 10 event or 1 event. So it will be more natural or easier to convert into exceedance frequency and define risk tolerance in the exceedance frequency chart, and it's common practice out there. And so I want to hear why the proposal is to look at like grouping events into a consequence per year, and then doing this unusual probability-based tolerance.
So I think those are, points that you can definitely make in your comments first. And I think that that's something that we can consider. But I'll let Matthew speak to some of your questions if he has any comments to it. I think that,
yeah, Yumi, no, I hear what you're saying. I'd like to see the comments, and I think that this is similar to the way FN curves are portrayed, like in ALARP discussions, and how to whether to portray this in terms of a frequency instead of likelihood. I think that that's a reasonable thing. We should look at it based on the way the risks are actually happening. But still, however you do it, you will still have some form of exceedance. And this is a conceptual argument that, this is how you will manage the risk tolerance to understand where your current level of post-mitigated risk is to your risk tolerance, and that gives you guidance on further mitigation requirements.
Okay, so the follow-up question on that is, so you have not considered exceedance frequency, meaning that like the frequency of having an event greater than certain consequence, that FN framework was not considered in developing your proposal. Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure I would say that it wasn't considered. It was just we figured this was the most general way to present it, given existing frameworks, and that's more why we did it this way.
yeah, Yumi, I think that it's definitely not accurate to say that we can consider it. I think that what you are, kind of responsible for doing at this point is trying to explain what your position is and how you think that that position should either integrate or improve upon what we've actually proposed. Does that make sense?
Okay.
I want to make sure that that's clear.
Okay, I understood. I wanted to hear whether there were any other thoughts about that approach that are more usual in a LARP framework
For
has been considered
certain
and
types of
dismissed.
risks, it's not necessarily that approach is not always used for every single risk that you would submit to your ramp filing. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Would you use that approach? And actually, I think that would be something that I would want to hear about in comments, is that the approach that you're currently describing using frequencies is an approach that you think can fit with every single one of your risks that you would submit to a ramp application. Because one of the important things that we want to make sure is that there's a universal approach, correct?
Right.
Okay.
Yes. So then the follow-up question is a LARP framework. I don't know whether that's part of the portfolio optimization part, but the LARP framework seems to be more easier or natural way to go, rather than trying to include the risk scaling on the risk tolerance and evaluate the benefit of the program in a risk neutral way.
Okay, that's something that you could also add into comments. But just also, can you just explain to me,
mm-hmm.
setting an ALARP program also requires more deliberation over 2 lines, right? Correct? Not just one.
Right. That can be done. I think the complexity with this approach could become each mitigation, depending on where it's done and which risk it addresses, it will have different threshold or the benchmark on where the cutoff should be.
Sure.
Even for the same wildfire risk programs, 2 mitigations or 2 projects could have different CBR threshold, because the scaling applied to that program is, if we look at it now, different programs have different scaling factor embedded in it. And so it becomes CBR, or cost benefit ratio, benefit cost ratio, becomes uncomparable even for the same risk. And so why you wouldn't differentiate the benefit calculation with the risk tolerance calculation and try to combine that into one risk tolerance line, which it may become not one risk tolerance, it may need to become like threshold for each individual mitigation if we wanted to do this.
I think that that's definitely accentuating some of the problems that I'm hearing from your approach that you're describing, because if you've heard the other interveners and what they're describing is even discussing one exceedance curve is going to take a lot of time, and it's going to be a discussion that's complicated. And adding in the ALARP approach, or adding in discussing each individual mitigation adds an additional amount of complexity. And so it sounds like you're advocating for a less transparent and more complex approach to dealing with risk tolerance.
I think that this approach may need to go more complex if
That's what it sounds
to
like.
work.
Okay. Well, I'll definitely take that into consideration when I read your comments, and we will explore that further. Thank you. Yeah, Tom.
Hi, this is Tom Long from Turn. I want to preface my remarks by saying something I think is probably true of many of us participating here, is that we're all deeply thinking about the proposal, trying to understand how it works and its ramifications. I know I will say definitively for Turn that we do not have any definitive position on pretty much any of this. We're thinking it through. So don't read anything into our questions, my questions, Dr. Feinstein's questions. We're thinking and we're trying to understand. So with that, but I will offer some comments in a moment, but I do want to start with a question about the Kurtz working group.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of expertise do you think a good member of that group, a valuable member of that group would want to have?
So, I mean, I think it's important that, the Kurtz working group definitely needs to be capable of representing Californians' perspective on risk tolerance. And I think that's why Dr. Mitchell was actually, kind of made a good point that all of us here in this proceeding, have, probably certain perspectives on risk tolerance and how the utilities should address that risk tolerance, but it may not be complete and comprehensive. And so I think that expertise is kind of a broad question, and I'm not sure that I have the complete answer for that. I think that everybody that's participating in this discussion does have the expertise for that, and that's one of the reasons why we've recommended that the folks that are parties to this proceeding and to the RAMP and GRC should participate. I'm not entirely confident that I can fill out the rest of the expertise that should also be included within the Kurtz working group at this time. And so I think we're looking for, recommendations and comments about, who else, parties feel should be included within the Kurtz working group. So I appreciate the question, but I don't think that I have the authority to kind of provide a definitive answer about what the expertise should be for that.
Well, I have various thoughts about that. I may struggle to express them concisely, and I apologize if I'm overly lengthy. I'll try not to be. One thought is, some of the folks that are participating in this workshop are, in order to understand what an exceedance curve is, whether the exceedance curve is even the right concept, whether this is correctly done, they are highly skilled and educated in their fields. And if what's going to be presented to the Kurtz working group is an exceedance curve, is that what we want the input from this group to be? Because they're not going to, I mean, I barely understand this. And I've spent a lot of time in these workshops over the years, and it's still a struggle for me. So I wonder whether we're looking for a unicorn, a group of unicorn individuals who have somehow marry this expertise with what I think what you're talking about, Eddie, is to people to express the diversity of perspectives about risk attitude in the state of California. And I wonder whether that's a...
Well, I think, Tom, there does need to be a translation of sorts, right? I mean, there's the important point that there is diversity of perspectives when it comes to risk tolerance, but somehow that does have to translate into some type of kind of theoretical construct that can then be transformed into numerical values that can guide the utilities decision making, and then transform back into a monetized approach that can guide the commission's decisions when it comes to the GRC. So I think that there could be, multiple iterations that I think Brian was kind of describing, even within the Kurtz working group. It's not just the utilities coming to us and providing us with, kind of their numerical presentation of this, but there's also going to have to be a translation of how does this actually represent, a citizen of California, and then there's going to have to be another translation back to them. So I think it is kind of an iterative approach that we're going to have to be facing.
Thank you for that. In the interest of time, I wonder whether we're going to be able to have, I mean, Turn is an organization that has an organizing department. We have, we may be unique among, certainly among interveners in that respect, in that we have outreach folks working with communities all over the state. And we're in meetings with the people all the time. We have a hotline for dealing with people with utility issues that they call us about and ask us to help with, and we help them quite a bit. And so we understand, I struggle with understanding the diversity of attitudes that people would likely have in response to the question of how much risk you can tolerate. I mean, if I'm struggling paycheck to paycheck and I'm thinking about what car to buy, maybe, I'm going to buy the car that's going to get me to my job, because if I don't get my job, keep my job, I'm going to be homeless. And my attitude toward risk is I can't afford a very safe car. I can afford the car I can afford, and safety is not. So I would not come out as risk averse. On the other hand, a utility, they're not spending their money. They're spending ratepayers' money.
Sure.
And so, I mean, your wanderer examples in your paper don't have the example of somebody whose money is not being spent. The utilities, they can buy that helicopter because it's not their money. And so it's sort of it's kind of like, of course the utilities are going to be risk averse. And as Joe mentioned, profitability depends on how much they spend on capital. So well, there's no question they're going to come in with a very risk averse function, but does that, anyway, so there's quite a diversity of attitudes out there. And I wonder whether this working group can somehow come to that. I do want to speak to one other thing. I know we're bumping up against your time limit, unless you want to have me come back later and speak.
Yeah, maybe that we actually could talk.
Okay, sure. I don't want to disrupt your schedule, sure.
But I just wanted to note that since you do have the public outreach and the ability to, see different perspectives, then I would hope that when Turn participates in the working group, that they would be able to bring, I mean, that is essentially your expertise in the working group, is understanding the diverse and plethora of perspectives when it comes to risk tolerance.
Yeah, but consolidating that into some sort of single view. I mean, I think when you're out there, you understand just how disparate people's thoughts are about these.
I mean, you're talking to an anthropologist. I understand that there's different various perspectives out there. It's our job technically to try and figure out a way to express that clearly.
Yeah.
So, yes. Okay. I do notice that there's some hands.
Eddie, quick question. I can shortcut a lot of stuff if I have a chat box. I'm not able to find mine. If that's not, if everybody else has one, could somebody from the support please reach out to me?
So Joe, if you look, there may be like a 3 dots, next to the participants potentially. And if you click on those dots, you should be able to open up the chat box.
Not seeing it, but yeah, that's why I keep interrupting. So,
Sure.
But while I'm interrupting, I'll just say my comment on what Tom just said is there are going to be technical tracks and there are going to be tracks where interests are represented. And so just keep that in mind. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think I'm going to run us into a break real quick, and then we can always come back and discuss some of the additional questions and hands raised in the final Q&A. So we'll be back in about 10 minutes at 11:25. Thanks, everybody. And George, maybe if you could help out Dr. Mitchell while we're on break, I'd really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, George. And Dr. Mitchell, let's see, how can we get your email to George? I think I can forward it to him.
Okay, I can tell you my phone as well if you want to hear that, or he can call. Should I give you my phone number?
Let's see, George, did you want Dr. Mitchell's phone number, or would you prefer to have his email?
Oh, if anything, I could just grab your email, doctor, and then I could send you like screenshots and stuff like that.
Okay, J.W. Mitchell, Mitchell at mbartech, M-B as in boy, A-R-T as in Thomas, E-K.com.
Well, apologies, Dr. Mitchell. You think you can either repeat that for me, or I don't know if like Eddie already has it. I could just take either or. Would you use that kind of?
Eddie has it. Oh, he might have walked away.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'll go ahead and ping him. Yeah.
George, I'll drop it into the chat.
Okay. Well, I can't see the chat. Oh, okay. You got the chat. Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Start bringing us back. If I could just get a couple thumbs ups from folks. Back. Thanks, CJ. Okay. I'll move us into the simple optimization discussion, which should go fairly quickly here. And I see that there's hands raised, but Dr. Feinstein, is it okay if I just run through this really quick and then we can start a Q&A and maybe we'll go back to the risk tolerance discussion after we have a Q&A about the portfolios?
That's okay with me, as long as we can get back to slides 36, 37, and so on.
Yeah, for sure. And you can keep your hand up there, and I'll make sure to call on you once we get through these next couple slides, and then maybe I'll take some questions on the portfolios first, and then we'll go back to your question about those slides. Thanks. So for now that we've kind of worked through risk tolerance, we'd like to switch gears to frame the staff proposal's approach to allowing optimization of risk portfolios within the RDF. But first, the RDF does need amendments to require the utility to present collections of mitigations in a portfolio. And this is necessary because we know that the mitigations can either be mutually exclusive or interrelated. The first case is very straightforward, and the relationship between cover conductor and undergrounding is kind of an obvious example in the context of wildfire risk. In the second case, the interrelated nature of mitigations can be thought of as being either synergistic, meaning that they work together, or having diminishing returns. And I think that that's fairly self-explanatory, but we can talk about that. And the point is we have to be considering these mitigations within a portfolio in order to quantitatively account for whether mitigations are mutually exclusive or interrelated. Now, once we understand these relationships between mitigations, we can begin to build the portfolios. With mutually exclusive mitigations, there are fewer possible combinations of portfolios for a given risk event. Now, regardless, with a large number of mitigations, the number of possible portfolio combinations can escalate pretty quickly. And that's why optimization is necessary. And as we'll see tomorrow, we're going to talk a little bit about things like efficient frontiers of portfolios. So it may not be necessary to construct every portfolio or it may not be necessary for the utility to construct every portfolio for analysis, because the goal is to calculate the costs and benefits of the portfolio, and then the utility and interveners and staff and decision makers can deliberate on a handful of those best portfolios, those best in terms of being optimized. So staff want to emphasize one thing, that the portfolios are really a heuristic for finding the most optimal way for the utility to implement multiple mitigations. But the utility must still present benefits and costs by program and activity in the RAMP and GRC filings. And additionally, work papers and data templates are still going to be expected to be available at the risk reporting unit. At least that's our recommendation that we made in our previous staff proposal that we discussed in workshop 1. And so we'll be discussing that further, I think, also when we get to the technical working groups in January. So I kind of wanted to go through these slides just as an opportunity to let people get back to the computer and also give folks an opportunity to think a little bit about this portfolio discussion. Of course, we can always talk about this a bit more tomorrow. We'll have some extra time at the end of tomorrow's presentation to talk through portfolios and optimization. But I did want to just offer the ability to kind of discuss the language that we're discussing and presenting within the staff proposal related to portfolios. So if anyone has some questions about that, I'd like to open that ability to ask questions about that first, and then we can go back and have a discussion about the RDF. And of course, if nobody has any, go back to discussing the risk tolerance. If there are no questions about portfolios, then we can go back to talking about risk tolerance. Mark, let's see, Brian, I think your hand is up because you also want to talk about risk tolerance. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think this is all related. Yeah.
Okay, great. And then Mark, could I ask if you're interested in the risk tolerance discussion or the portfolio discussion. Or sorry, Brian, did you have something on portfolios that you wanted to say, or no?
Sure. Yeah. Let me start there.
Oh.
So, yeah. So, I just heard here, and that was one of my questions. So you would have to, what you're envisioning is you'd have to construct portfolios at the RRU level, the tranche, the asset level, whatever rolls up into meeting against the risk tolerance profile that has been determined by the Kurtz Group or recommended by the Kurtz Group. Is that your understanding?
So the portfolio would be made up of various mitigations, and those mitigations are made up of RRUs. That's how we're conceptually seeing it, yes. And then depending on how much risk the portfolio reduces, that will then be evaluated as to whether or not the remaining overall residual risk would approach the risk tolerance level.
Yeah, so I guess my concern is that it goes back to what you, just building on what Yumi was saying in the last session, is that in order to do this correctly, the correct way, and I know it's overly complex, you would have to do this, define a risk tolerance in every single asset, and then determine an exceedance curve of every single asset, and then determine portfolios that can meet that exceedance curve based on each of the drivers and failure modes that you're mitigating against, which could be different in every asset. For instance, you wouldn't want to propose vegetation management for assets that have no vegetation around them, but it could be in high wind areas. So I know that what you're trying to describe is sort of a system-wide approach, but when you get down to the specifics of individual assets, you're going to miss a lot of risk, and there's going to be a lot of intolerable margin for error around all of these portfolios. So I'm just trying to understand what the marginal utility of this is. That's number one. And then number two is, has any industry within any utility performed this, and what has been the result? So I think that's more germane to, the overall analysis.
I think, as the commissioner pointed out at the beginning of yesterday, the RDF proceeding in general is something that's unique to California, and there's a lot of commissions around the country who actually reach out to us on a regular basis for advice about how to implement this approach into their own commission. And so
no one has done this before.
I think that it's the approach towards portfolios is something that's definitely an approach that has been used outside of maybe the utility industry. But as to whether or not it's been used in the utility industry, I'm not currently aware of that.
Okay, thank you.
And maybe Matthew can help fill us in if he's aware of any areas where this has been used previously.
Yes, no, the portfolio approach has been widely used in the financial and insurance industries, since the 1980s. So there is a ton of experience in doing this and the modeling and the math around it, and so that we are saying is that we should look outside, the energy industry for this model, and we think it's very applicable. I also like to address something that Brian said. You do not need to have risk tolerance at the asset level at all. No, the risk tolerance is going to be set at a very high level in the organization, and the key is to be able to aggregate the risks within the portfolio and total them up, and it's that total portfolio risk distribution that you would compare.
Sorry, I have to disagree, because you can have someone die at every single asset. This is not financial trading. You can actually have a failure mode that causes death at every single asset. So this is not.
Of course you can. That's a risk. It's the same thing at a financial model. We're talking. That's the risk. You need to have the probability distribution of the risk. You're not going to have a tolerance. You're not going to have a tolerance at individual asset level. That's what I'm saying is the tolerance is at a high roll up point. But you are correct that we are talking about having the probability distributions at a low level. And based on our reading of ramps and other documents, it feels like the SCE and the other utilities have made a lot of progress on probabilistic modeling at a fairly granular level. But that's kind of what we were talking about yesterday, to really, that we do really need to understand that.
Let's see. I'll go ahead and let Mark add his comment there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. And I can it's good because I can build off of Matthew's comments here about drawing inspiration from, you know, presumably the Markowitz, right, mean variance portfolio optimization scheme. You know, in finance, partly what makes that practical is the fact that you can fine tune your portfolio allocations to the cent, right? It's kind of, you have continuous levers. You got a liter of water, you divide it between 3 cups of water, right? You can tune it each to the milliliter. Here, as you've pointed out, you know, one of the issues is that there's a discrete nature to the problem when you start to apply it to, you know, the kind of issues that we face. And so you don't want to create the power set of portfolios. You can't really leverage the calculus that gives you the optimal portfolio in the Markowitz setting, which is, you know, another issue, but that's also predicated on expected utility theory. And so in this framework, when we're talking about reducing this to a manageable set via optimization, it would really help to understand what concretely we mean by that. Is there a specific quantitative algorithm we have in mind, or is this
right,
a qualitative concept as well?
I think, as I mentioned, you know, I think at the beginning of the presentation, we're going to be discussing optimization a little bit more tomorrow. We'll run through an example. I just want to make sure that I can state this now, that the example that we're going to run through tomorrow, you know, the staff proposal is presenting it as an example. We're not mandating a particular algorithm or a particular optimization approach. We're mandating a few requirements, including that there must be budget constraints that are attached to these portfolios. And that's necessary in order to address the current affordability crisis that we're in. But I think there is flexibility in terms of how we're going to look at optimization of these portfolios. And I hope that helps answer your question, Mark.
Got it. So just let me repeat that, echo that back to you to make sure I'm understanding. You know, the principal goal here is just to make sure that we understand there are budget constraints and that we need to think about the synergistic or interactive effects of different mitigation programs when they're put in place simultaneously. But exactly how we go about that is not intended to be particularly prescriptive or even necessarily completely quantitative. It's really up to us.
I think it's going to be quantitative in the sense that you'll still have to do two things. You'll still have to present the cost efficiency of every single mitigation that you present, correct? And you're still going to need to demonstrate that the portfolio reduces a certain amount of risk and approaches you know, a risk tolerance level. And also keep in mind that what is described in the portfolio, the risk reduction, the cost benefit, you know, the cost efficiency of it, all of that is also part of the RMR that we're going to be discussing in December. And so, you know, there's going to be an approach where what you present within these portfolios, within your optimal portfolio, would then become part of the RMR record, essentially. And we would be looking at the performance of the risk, you know, mitigation portfolio that you're implementing and determining what's the best way to hold you accountable to that particular portfolio. So I don't think it's quite correct to say that it's 100%, you know, that it's unquantitative.
Okay, understood. I didn't mean to say unquantitative. I just meant, you know, it seems like it's more than likely going to be a hybrid approach.
I think what your point is that there could be certain non-quantitative constraints that can also determine what is the optimal portfolio. Is that essentially what you're asking?
I think so, but I think that would need to be fleshed out once we have the details of
Okay, yeah, we'll
right,
talk
the
about it.
portfolio optimization.
That sounds good. Yeah, we can talk about that a little bit tomorrow. Miles, yes, please.
Hey, Miles, Cal Advocates. I have a somewhat higher level question. I'm just trying to wrap my head around how SPD is conceptualizing a portfolio because, I mean, for example, I know that Edison already kind of does a portfolio style approach in their mitigation deployment for wildfire, like the undergrounding CC++, CC RevCol++, etc. And I'm just trying. I guess my question is just like, is the way that SPD is conceptualizing a portfolio similar or the same to what Edison is already doing, or what are the differences? I guess.
I don't know if I can say specifically that what Edison is doing is exactly the way that the portfolio approach that we're interpreting. I'd have to think a little bit about what the differences might be. But at least the basic premise of the portfolio approach is indeed that the portfolios can or do represent the collaborative risk reduction, essentially, of multiple mitigations. In some cases, the mitigations might be, mutually exclusive. And so, if it's covered conductor and undergrounding, then even if they're contained within the portfolio, they don't reduce risk together, if that makes sense, Miles. So I think the synergistic approach is looking at how covered conductor could work with other mitigations to reduce risk, and making sure that the risk reduction is clear, that the efficiency of risk reduction is made clear, and so I think that's the goal of the portfolio.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Yeah, Gary.
Hi, this is Gary from Southern California Edison. Could we go to the next slide, please?
Wait, the next slide? Yeah,
Yes.
you want to look at the definition?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around a mitigation group versus a mitigation portfolio. Is a group a subset of a portfolio?
I mean, there would be groups, yes, within the portfolio. It's just the idea. It's basically the M1, M3, I think. Like that's the combination of the two together would be a group. But they're, if you have lots of different mitigations within the portfolio, then it could be different combinations of those mitigations together that would have the synergistic or the mutually reinforcing, the synergistic or the diminishing return relationship.
I guess when we do our ramp, we have a mitigation portfolio of vegetation, cover conductor, undergrounding, right? So that is the portfolio. And it's not like we're putting a cover conductor and undergrounding on the same asset, right? So have we defined the portfolio correctly? Where does the group come in?
Right, so the group would be the vegetation management, potentially with covered conductor, if that's your, preferred approach. There would be some type of a relationship between vegetation and covered conductor. I would hope that vegetation management is not combined with undergrounding. If it is, it would need to be very clearly explained why. But yeah, that's the essential idea of defining the group, is trying to get the utility to explain like what's the relationship between these two mitigations.
Okay, that was my first question. Thanks. And then my second question is, I know as part of the RDF, we are required to provide two alternative portfolios. How does that comport with this whole optimization approach?
I mean, I think that's a great question. I'd like to actually hear a little bit about that in comments, actually, because one of the things that I think comes out of ramp analyses is a general disappointment in how alternatives are presented in the ramp. We're definitely considering that, you know, when a utility submits their primary portfolio, that they should present a alternative portfolio that, you know, is not just a carbon copy of the you know, the optimal portfolio that they've discovered. So we do hope that you know, I mean, optimization and you know, the flexibility that we're providing with this approach should allow the utilities to come up with some very, you know, practical and diverse optimal portfolios. I don't think just, you know, reducing the, you know, in wildfire example, I don't think that reducing the undergrounding in one portfolio by just 1 mile is an example of a good alternative. And I think most of us in staff would agree that that would be very disappointing, and I don't think a very good use of anybody's time, frankly. So yeah, that's what we're expecting and looking for. And if it needs to be made explicit, then that is something that we may need to make an adjustment in the RDF in order to make sure that that's done appropriately. So thanks for bringing that up, Gary. Let's see. I think Dr. Feinstein and Mark both have their hands up to, Yumi, did you want to discuss the portfolio, or did you want to go back to the previous question?
Oh, this exact slide is
okay.
Okay. So based on what you're describing, it seems to me that the mitigations here are the mitigations that are used or to be proposed to reduce the risk further from the residual risk. Is that correct?
Yeah, from the overall residual risk that's left over.
Yes.
I mean, a ramp, the whole purpose of a ramp essentially is to propose a portfolio that would reduce the overall residual risk.
Yes, and so we have a lot of controls, right? So for example, vegetation management, the overall residual risk that we currently have is the outcome of continuously investing on those controls.
It maintains the overall residual risk at a certain
And
level.
so would those be out of the scope for this portfolio analysis?
Why exactly would they be outside? Because you're still paying for them.
Right. So then residual, it's not trying to reduce the residual risk. Those were needed to keep up the residual risk at the current level.
Yeah, but you have to, if it's not inside the portfolio, then you wouldn't be able to maintain the level that you're currently at, and then add in additional permanent risk reduction that would reduce you towards your risk tolerance level. The money is still being billed essentially, and so it should be part of the portfolio. Yes, I fail to see why it wouldn't.
Yeah, so there's some embedded assumption in the current residual risk that it is the outcome of the investment in the controls, right?
Yeah.
Continuous maintenance, vegetation management, all of the compliance work, and what we have been doing in the past, right? And so if we don't spend on those, the risk will go up, and it's usually it will be pretty uncertain on what that level will be. And so do we start from residual risk at the inherent risk that we cannot verify, or do we start from something that's concrete that we know that, okay, we have been doing these controls over the past many years, and then here is where we are, but then we know that it's above the risk tolerance, and so let's discuss what further mitigations will get us to the tolerable level. So then, to me, it seems like that portfolio optimization need to be a little bit limited, not to open up all of the things that were embedded in the residual risk.
Wait, you're saying that the portfolio would, it's limited? You
Yeah.
think that it should be limited to
It
not?
should be shouldn't be limited beyond like right to the true mitigations.
I see. So, well, yeah, so what you're arguing is that the portfolio should not include controls.
Right.
Okay. So a couple questions. One is, why is it that you're unable to understand what the inherent risk is?
So if you want to do vegetation management, routine vegetation management that has been ongoing since more than 20 years, right? How do we know how many ignition steps we will have or how many failures we have? We don't test it. We cannot test it because it's out of compliance. And it's different by location on how many ignition steps we will have without vegetation management and the regular maintenance. And so I think that number, the inherent risk number is huge and it's very uncertain. And so including that highly uncertain number in the optimization will not result in a good result or reasonable results. And it can sway a lot by.
Yeah, please feel free to add that into your discussion on the portfolios within comments, and we'll definitely consider it. I think Tom raised his hand, so I want to see if he has a specific comment directly to that.
I did, and I put it in the text in the chat. This has been an ongoing concern about how PG&E does its risk evaluation. Controls can reduce residual risk, and procedures can be improved. And if you're improving your procedures and spending more money on them, you shouldn't be doing that unless you're getting some risk reduction benefits, residual risk reduction benefits from it. Yet this hasn't been taken into account, and this is a problem.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, was there any additional comments that folks had on the portfolios? If not, I think I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Feinstein, who I think wanted to go back to slide 36. Is that right?
Thank you. I actually had a couple of questions about the optimization.
Oh,
so
sure.
if you'll allow me, let me ask 3 questions about optimization. First is, what is the objective function?
Okay.
Second is, what are the constraints? Third is, what are the decision variables?
Okay, I think actually, Dr. Feinstein, is it okay if we hold off on those questions until tomorrow after we go through the example?
Sure.
Yeah, because I think at least our example provides some of the answers to that. And then we could discuss whether or not the example, provides the kind of right guidance for the utilities. And then, yeah, I think it'll be easier to have that conversation.
Okay with me. That's fine.
Wait,
Then
did you
maybe
have?
Go back to slide 37.
Okay. Thanks.
Actually, I'm sorry. Go back to 38, please.
Okay, no problem.
37 was answered. In 38, my question is, in order to implement this methodology, do you need anything other than a scaling function?
Do you mean to address the impact that risk scaling would have on the risk tolerance exceedance curve?
Yes, if you want to think about it that way. It seems to me that what you're driving at here is expressing risk tolerance. And so in order to do that, it seemed to me that you need a scaling function.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you need?
At present, the RDF only allows a scaling function to express risk attitude, I think was what you meant. That the scaling function is the kind of method and operation that the utilities have to express their attitude towards risk. Yes.
Okay. And then I have a question about the Kurtz.
Okay.
Can you please explain to me why risk tolerance varies by attribute?
So yes, why the risk tolerance would be why it could be different depending on if it's financial reliability or safety. Correct.
Yes, that's the question.
Yeah, yeah. So the idea is essentially that the Kurtz working group could discuss how each of the attributes could have their individual exceedance curves that then aggregate up to a total risk exceedance curve. That's the general premise.
But is it not the case that this is what confuses me, and maybe you can clarify, that all the risk exceedance curves are measured in dollars, not in natural units? And so when you're combining all of these things, you're combining dollars. What I don't understand is why the tolerance for risk measured in dollars varies by what causes the risk.
Right. So the discussion that the Kurtz working group could have is looking at least at the attribute level, they could have the discussion about the tolerance towards the natural units themselves. And then that becomes monetized, and then you receive a risk tolerance curve that's monetized.
Good. Thank you very much.
Okay. Let's see, Chris, did you want to jump in here?
Yes, thank you. Is this a time to talk about slide 55?
Sure. Yeah, we can go back to 55. I'll open up for general questions now, starting now. D5. Okay, yes.
Okay, thank you. So here, let's see. Actually, maybe I'm off. Can we look at slide 56 for a moment?
You bet. Yep.
Okay, I think this is the better slide. Here it discusses the strategy for a presentation in the ramp and the GRC. And it says that the utilities filing will provide a ranking of all the ramp mitigations, and that the utility must justify the portfolio selection, optimization, and the structure of these mitigation groups. And I believe Gary, touched upon this earlier when they talked about alternative mitigations.
Yes.
And so a question that I would have, so given, experience in the ramps, I guess a question arises, what if if we're given an example of wildfire, let's say, undergrounding or cover conductor, and generally those might be considered exclusive mitigations, but the expectation would be that a utility would submit an alternative so that the commission could evaluate, the difference in many different aspects, I believe, not only the, benefits and cost and everything. So the question is, what if a utility provides undergrounding, but doesn't provide, for example, covered conductor as a lower cost alternative wildfire mitigation to undergrounding? That's kind of like the question.
I see. Yeah, I mean, in that case, then it would appear that they have not provided an alternative analysis, correct? Because they've only provided one single mitigation. And if the alternative is simply just reducing that mitigation by a certain mileage, that does not really provide any decision maker with a valid alternative. And I think that staff have made that fairly explicit, I think, in multiple venues.
Yeah, so, but given that, it seems like, where do we go from there? Should the RDF, should there be a requirement that, from the get-go, that subject to penalty, that a utility must diligently uncover the best mitigation method from a ratepayer perspective? It seems like that would be an appropriate inclusion in the RDF. Should there be that kind of a requirement?
I think it might. I think that's definitely a valid discussion to have within the comments. And
Okay.
yeah, I would appreciate hearing, but in particular, Chris, I would be interested in hearing like what particular language we could or should add into the RDF in order to address alternatives appropriately and to make sure that it integrates with the portfolio approach.
Okay.
Because one of the things, you know, that you just said that kind of rang my bell is that the alternative approach would also need to be optimal, right? It would need to be optimal, and they would still need to be able to describe the structure of the mitigation groups. They would need, you know, they would have to describe the portfolio selection. I think one of the things that we've done with alternatives in general is we haven't required like the really in-depth like narrative description of the alternative that we do with the primary proposal. And I think that still makes sense that what we're really looking at is kind of, you know, the alternative's final results. What is the mitigation makeup within the portfolio? But then what is the, you know, the risk reduction? What is the cost benefit ratio of the portfolio and whatnot? And there could be maybe something else to ask and discuss within comments, maybe should alternatives also require some type of a work paper that gets into some of the more nitty-gritty details of, you know, what is the cost benefit ratio for each alternative at you know, at a specific point within the asset system, or within, you know, at the tranche level and things like that. So
yeah. So there's a concern because it was, you know, at the opening of this workshop, you know, the concern about, you know, the rates crisis, right?
Sure.
And so there is a natural, you know, market incentive for an operator to propose and justify mitigations that earn the greatest rate of return. So the question then becomes, how can the commission mitigate that incentive in this update to the risk framework so that there is an obligation, there's an expectation? I would think the question is, how can that be mitigated? Because it's not just a matter of having an alternative submitted, but should there be an expectation, a requirement for utilities to really dig into the analysis to uncover the best mitigation for ratepayers, you know, as opposed to, you know, other, you know, operating incentives that an entity might have. And right now, it doesn't look like the strategy includes that explicitly. So, and I could imagine an operator submitting alternatives and doing a robust analysis, but if it begins with the direction that, okay, the commission is not just looking for alternatives, the commission's looking to address this rates crisis. And so it's explicit that that's what needs to come in terms of proposals. And so that's my question. I don't see that currently on this mitigation strategy, but that would be our question. Okay.
well, I mean, I would say definitely please feel free to address that within comments, and we'll review it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Dr. Mitchell, I saw that you posted something in the chat, but did you want to come off mute and discuss your comment?
Sure. Yeah, just to address Chuck's comment, you know, the value that people put on risk mitigation may be expressed in dollars, but the amount of dollars they're willing to spend on a mitigation or the amount of risk they're willing to tolerate varies on who that person is. So that's why I think when we're talking about the risk tolerance, we're talking about having a lot of stakeholders in the room to make sure that everybody's values are appropriately incorporated into the discussion. But I agree that, you know, if you can put it in terms of dollars, that at least allows you to have a common language to discuss the various perspectives that different stakeholders have.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Dr. Feinstein, I see you still have your hand up. Did you want to make another point, or is that just a legacy hand?
No, sorry, that was my error. I keep forgetting to do that.
No worries. Let's see. Russell, please.
Good afternoon. Just one quick response to Dr. Mitchell's comment. Has the commission considered the legislature's perspective on risk tolerance, specifically as it relates to wildfire, and specifically, even more specifically, as the statutory language in SB 901 reflects? That's my first question. My second question is, has staff considered the financial implications to ratepayers of not pursuing highly effective but relatively more expensive on the front end mitigations in the form of litigation costs, damages, lawsuits, etc.?
Okay.
And how should those externalities be factored into the financial equation?
Right. So I appreciate that you're directing these questions to us, and I think that you're more than welcome to ask those in comment. Or I wouldn't say ask. I would recommend that you try to answer those questions in your comments with your concerns about how our approach is currently, related to some of the concerns about the financial impacts of a potential risk event. And remember, it's a potential risk event. Of course, SB 901 was considered when we considered this approach. Is there a particular reason that you think that it doesn't address that particular legislation? And if so, I'd appreciate hearing about that within your comments.
We can certainly address that in comments. I would just note the statutory language from SB 901 that requires the utilities to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires to the greatest extent reasonably feasible. That's what's driving it.
And as far as I understand, I don't see why this particular approach would be at odds to that language, but if you can provide comment on that, we would review it. I do want to address one point about the financial aspect. There's also the financial risk of regulatory risk, correct? There is an affordability crisis that cannot be ignored. And when a utility presents highly expensive options for reducing risk and does not consider the more cost-efficient means of reducing that risk, it actually drives regulatory risk for the utility. And there are credit agencies who are currently discussing this publicly as being a concern for them, that the high amounts of revenue requests that are being submitted to commissions all over the country. This isn't just in California. I want to make sure that that's clear. But all of that is something that credit agencies do consider when they're evaluating the credit reliability of a utility. So I just want to make sure that we have thought about that. And it is definitely a concern for us. The affordability crisis is a concern for us. And we do see that as a financial concern in general, not just for ratepayers, but in general. So I hope that's clear. But I would appreciate hearing any additional comments that SCE might have on this particular topic. I think, Tom, it looks like you also had a comment that you wanted to make on this topic.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to comments before the break. I was
okay.
I wanted to come back to some Joe's comments about the decision-making dynamic in the Kurtz structure, that the idea of consensus and miracles can happen, but maybe not. Maybe the consensus wouldn't be reached. And then what happens? And I guess one question was, as I read the proposal and the language, I think the Kurtz ends up being advisory to the utility, and then the utility is free to do something other than what the Kurtz recommends, and then has to explain deviations from what Kurtz recommends.
I think what our understanding is that there's going to be a consensus that comes from the Kurtz working group. And if the utility deviates from that consensus, they will definitely need to provide a justification because ultimately, and I think this is what Dr. Mitchell was referring to, the commission will need to make a ruling or issue a decision based off of whether or not they, feel strongly about the CURT's consensus or the utility's justification. I think there was an idea, at least from staff's perspective, that there could be instances where the consensus towards risk tolerance needs to be adjusted between the time when the consensus is established and when a ramp or not likely a ramp, but when a GRC is filed. And if there's a justification for why that has to be adjusted, it needs to be presented in the GRC, and then there's an opportunity for that to be litigated within the GRC, and then for the commissioners to make a decision on that at that point. So I appreciate though the discussion about thinking a little bit procedurally as to when and how does the CURTS working group present their consensus, and how does that interact with RAMP and GRC? And yeah, if there's any comments that you can provide about and recommendations that you can provide about how that could work, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Eddie. And I'll just briefly highlight a dynamic that I think folks are aware of, but I just want to sort of make it explicit that what seems to be happening a lot is interveners raise issues about the utilities risks assessment, et cetera, in the ramp. And some of it gets, SPD puts out a report and sometimes they agree with interveners, sometimes not, or sometimes they don't say much about what the interveners said. I would put it in the category of that in the most recent PG&E ramp report. Joe Mitchell put in extensive comments on the risk scaling function, and Tern put in comments, and I didn't see them addressed at all. And that's fine. Everybody's got too much to do, and but that's our chance, right, to express critiques of the scaling function and the justifications for it. And there's never going to be a resolution because what's been going on in the GRCs is understandably the ALJs and staff feel like we don't have time to be dealing with issues of scaling functions and the like. And, and the utilities will say, oh, that's what you can take care of that in the RDF proceeding. And so it doesn't get addressed. And again, all understandable. But that's a dynamic that is not addressing sort of in a timely way anyway, the big picture issues about some of these very momentous decisions that affect, CBRs and previously RSEs, and here would affect us, the risk tolerance, exceedance curves, et cetera. And so it's a concerning dynamic.
Sure, I appreciate that. And if you could provide some comments about where we may need to adjust language within our recommendations or in particular, if there's any language that has to be adjusted in, these sections where we're actually adjusting the RDF. If there's some language that you feel needs to be adjusted so that there's, the right amount of guidance that ensures that risk tolerance is properly addressed within a GRC, please add that to your comments and we'll definitely consider it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you. Yumi.
Thank you, Eddie. Let's see which slide it is. It's CBR changes to the RDF.
This one?
Yeah, where you require the CBR to be calculated based on expected value.
Okay.
Yeah. So it is common practice in the finance world to use risk neutral probability to compute the expected value of outcome to value options and financial products and mitigations. And that risk neutral probability is something that you adjust the real world probability to represent, to adjust for the risk, right? So in the benefit cost calculation for the mitigations, if we were to follow the finance approach, right, the benefit of the mitigations should capture the risk adjustment, just like how the finance evaluates it. And so just using the expected value of outcomes, potential outcomes under the real world probability will not represent the value of the true value of the mitigations. So that's what.
Wait, why?
I want to ask you why that has been dismissed under this proposal while adopting another different approach. But also you say it's coming from the finance world.
All right. Matthew, I'll let you jump on that one if you wanted to address that. Otherwise,
Yeah. So just let me make sure I understand your point. Using an example, suppose a mitigation, did a very good job of reducing tail risk. You'd want to add like the equivalent of a premium to the value of that benefit for the calculation of the cost benefit. Is that what you're suggesting?
It is common practice in the finance world to use risk adjusted. It's called risk neutral probability. And the markets, just like how we have set our risk scaling function in this ramp, the markets provide that what risk adjustment is in the financial world using the volatility. So the evaluation of financial options or derivatives are evaluated under risk neutral probability, which is not the real world probability, and it's similar to how we are scaling, although a little different.
So I agree that in finance, there is a common use of calculating risk premium and adding it to the expected or subtracting it from the expected value. I think it is common use for certain applications, but not all applications. And so I think we have to be careful about just making the assumption that you can do that, the risk premium approach for everything that we want to do here in mitigating, utility risks. So I think it should not be an automatic assumption that it makes sense to do that. And I would, caution, especially around, even though we're monetizing safety and reliability, that does not make them equivalent to financial instruments. So, I just want to raise that. Now, directly to the idea of could we do it? Would it make sense to do for, calculating, a risk-adjusted BCR? I'll have to think about that. It's an interesting idea. And so we'll take that as a to-do to see if that's, a reasonable thing to do so that you give more credit to benefits that, have an outsized impact on tail risk. I think that's an interesting concept.
I just want to clarify, though, that if we're scaling the risk units at the same time as scaling risk tolerance, there's a fear that there may be a bit of double counting going on. And I think that's one of the other reasons that we're moving away from that approach.
Yeah, I agree. That is the risk, and we don't want to have things that make everything look like they have fabulous BCRs. But I understand the point that Yumi is making, and
Well, I think it's something that
it's something to look at to see what the implications of that would be. So
Yeah.
as a takeaway for us.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to me, like risk tolerance is risk tolerance. It is not adjusted for the scaling. Tolerance is tolerance. You said it
scaling is a
regardless of
function.
use.
Yeah, but scaling is just a function of the attitude of the utility towards risk, and it's therefore translated into the risk tolerance of the people of California and their level of risk aversion to tolerance.
Or clarify more in the comment.
Okay. Mark.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much new to add to that conversation, but I would maybe support Yumi and contest the point that, this may not be applicable to this situation because it's all hinges on just explaining the fact that I would rather have $50 million for certain than a half lottery between nothing and 100 million, right? That idea, you can capture that through ostensibly different procedures, such as having a risk neutral probability measure, such as having expected utility theory, such as having risk tolerance. But I think we want to do things in the way that's most transparent, probably the most orthodox, including, a procedure that is underpinned by the literature that was cited as motivation for this, right? The Markowitz portfolio optimization. And so, there are ways to address this that I think are pretty well tested and well adopted that speak exactly to this notion of risk aversion. And, to your point, Eddie, there is potentially a double counting issue, but then if the question is, should we think about the more mainstream approach or doing something that's untested, it would seem to be riskier to do, right? No pun intended, to choose one over the other.
Okay. Yeah, feel free to address that in your comments as well. I think coming close on time, so I do want to make sure that some folks get the ability to raise their questions. So Brian, if you want to.
Hey, thanks, Eddie. So I just want to build on something Mark and Yumi just mentioned, but I just want to clarify this. I don't think it'd be double counting to have a scaling function on tolerance, but also consider the option value of individual assets and the risk on those. And I can give an example. So if I'm a financial institution and I have a certain portfolio-wide risk tolerance level, I may have already established a separate option value on individual assets there. So I think those can happen congruently. So I'm not sure it would be double counting.
Sorry, Brian, I agreed on that, right? But I guess the point Yumi was making was that it's the same risk neutral measure underlying the calculation of that options price as, right? So it's still one unified framework. It's not that you don't want to look at the option value, but imposing a totally different risk conceptualization to address the options framework would seem to be unnecessary.
I agree. I think, again, I've said this a few times today and yesterday, if you really want to do this correctly and accurately, you really need to look at the bottoms up model to understand those individual tolerances at the individual locations. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty around that tolerance level as the curve bends. So that's what I'd be cautious about with this approach. But just something to consider. Thanks, guys.
Dr. Mitchell, you've had your hand up, but I wasn't sure if it was a legacy hand or did you have something else that you were adding and I forgot to call on you.
Legacy hand, sorry.
No worries. Yes, Mike. Mr. Gorman. Oh, I see you came off mute, but I don't think we can hear you. Want to give it one more try? Must be a microphone problem. Maybe you could, oh, wait, thought I sort of heard you. Want to give it a shot? Nope. Okay, maybe you could include your comment in the chat, and we'll let Vincent go ahead.
Hey Eddie, it's Vincent here from PG&E. Just reflecting on some of the comments that I've seen in the chat, and particularly the one from Dr. Mitchell, right? I mean, you know, and it strikes me that as I read through the proposal, you know, this conversation we've been having kind of brings out like brings out basically something that I didn't see in the proposal, which is basically like what are the guiding objectives, guiding principles that we're seeking after, right? We want to go after a framework. We want to put together a framework for solving a problem. What problem does this framework need to solve, right? For example, I heard something like we want it to be iterative. That's a feature that we want of this framework. We heard feature of this, it needs to be budget constrained. I think it would be nice to see, which I haven't seen exactly what these kinds of things that this framework is supposed to solve, right? I mean, Dr. Mitchell talks about software. I remember I did a software project and we always started off, maybe it's old school, but we always started off with functional specs. What do we want the software to achieve, right? And use case testing, things like that, you know, it's like, I think we kind of missed that step before we got into solving the problem and going down the technical kind of approach.
Okay.
So as usual, I know I hear you will put that down in comments, but it just strikes me right now. It's like I don't see that.
Okay,
That's
I think
all
it's
have to
pretty
say.
clear that what we're asking for and what the proposal is recommending is that we're looking at setting an acceptable amount of overall residual risk that represents the appetite for that risk from the perspective of Californians,
Yeah,
and that there's budget constraints that need to be put in place in order to control the amount of spending that happens to invest in mitigations that get us to that overall residual risk point.
Yeah, I
So
think we need another level of detail to go there, right? Because we talked about we in this conversation we talk about tolerance might not be tolerance might depend on what we can afford, and that leads to like okay, then we need some iteration here. We talked about it, right? We perhaps need this back and forth between tolerance and affordability. Like we need to recognize that's something that this framework needs to have. So I think we need more details in terms of the objectives that we ultimately want, and we need to start there with those principles. That's all I have to say. So
well, I'm going to say add it into your comments.
And testing too. I just want to mention we also.
Okay, thank you, Vincent. Actually, we're almost right on time at 12:30, so I think I'm going to leave it at that. There's a lot of comments in the chat, and I really appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Marsha. There is not expected to be a summary of the Q&A of the workshop because there's going to be a video that will be posted online, and I'll talk about that tomorrow because we'll be posting videos for all of the discussion that's happened here. And so I'll kind of go over some next steps at the end of tomorrow's presentation, but I think we'll wrap up here because tomorrow we're actually going to be discussing the example of optimization, and we'll take some more Q&A on that particular topic, and then we can have a general discussion over any of the topics that. Sorry. Okay, thanks, Ed. I think maybe somebody came off mute at the wrong time, but that's okay. I think we're going to wrap up anyway, so I'll go ahead and stop the recording, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.